I begin with active movements of the elbow, wrist and hand. I begin by telling my client to point her fingers up to the ceiling to perform wrist extension. I then get her to flip her hands over and to once again point her fingers to the ceiling for wrist flexion. I then get her to point her pinkies into each other to perform ulnar deviation. I then get her to point her thumbs outward to perform radial deviation. I then repeat all these movements but with passive. This means that I will be doing all the movements for her, making sure she is relaxed throughout. Here I'm performing wrist extension. I then repeat the passive motion of me doing wrist flexion on both hands. I will then passively perform ulnar deviation on each hand and then radial deviation on each hand. Throughout, I'm looking to see if my client is in any pain and to make sure that they're getting the full range of motion possible and that they are relaxed. We then begun with our resisted movements. Here we are performing isotonic contractions. I'll be getting her to push up against my hands and telling her not to let me move her. This is resisted wrist extension. I then get her to repeat this, flipping her hands over and to once again push up. This is an isotonic contraction for wrist flexion. We then move on to resisted isometric contractions, beginning with radial deviation. We then repeated this isometric contraction, however onto ulnar deviation, once again telling her to push against me. We then moved on to active movements of the elbow. I began with flexion of the elbow by telling her to imagine she's putting her palms on her shoulders, causing the biceps brachii to contract. We then went into elbow extension. I told her to push her arms back as far as she could. I then get her to pronate by saying to put her palms facing the ground. I then changed this movement into supination by telling her to face her palms to the ceiling. We then repeated these with a passive motion. From here, I went straight into extension of the elbow, and then from supination into pronation, making sure she is relaxed throughout, and repeated this on both sides. I once again asked her if she was in any pain and kept looking at her face to indicate if there was any. We then went into isotonic resisted movements. We started with flexion of the elbow and I got her to push up against my arm as much as she could, trying to not let me move her. We then did a more fixed position of the elbow for extension as it could not move as much due to its structure. We then repeated this on both sides so I could compare one side to the other. In order for her to do an isotonic resisted movement of arm extension, I laid her face down on the bed and started her in flexion and got her to resist against me all the way into her full extension. I then once again repeated this on both sides, making sure that she was comfortable and was not in any pain. We then did a resisted isotonic movement for supination into pronation, once again telling her to try not let me move her hand round, moving from one position into the other. We once again repeated this on both hands. I then demonstrated to my client a functional movement. For this, I did a push-up against the wall. This is so that I could see all the structures working together in order to perform a functional movement. This helps me understand her range of motion and how all structures are working together.